We're now going to have a panel mediated by Joe Wehby, featuring Renee Bradley and Joan McLaughlin.
Yes, so we've talked this last 2 days a lot about Lynn's influence on her doctoral students, her colleagues, both at Vanderbilt and across the field. And this panel is really designed to describe her influence on a bigger scale, in my opinion, sort of the work and the contributions that she made to this field of education through the Department of Education since she started. And so we've got two of my favorite people here representing Joan McLaughlin, who used to be the director of the National Center for Special Education Research, and Renee Bradley, who was a longtime OSEP person and now is at the Office of Special Education, Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, thank you. And we're just going to talk a little bit about her work and her influence with Doug on policies and approaches in education. And I would argue that some of the things that we do today as researchers, as teacher trainers, can be directly tied to the influence that she had on these departments. So I'm going to ask them some questions separately, and I'm going to ask them some questions collectively, and they're going to give us some responses. So Joan, the first question is for you.
All right.
You ready?
Yeah, I think I'm ready. This is
Okay.
working. Okay.
So can you talk a little bit about the early days of NICSR and the role that Lynn played in supporting the center's mission as it became the primary funder of special education research?
I will try. First of all, I want to thank everybody for staying and for being so alert at this time. I also know that we just had lunch, and so I don't think Renee or I would mind if anyone needs to stand up or stretch or whatever to keep going. I have a couple of things I want to say before I get into Joe's question. One is, federal employee, you got to say this at the beginning. My comments today are based on my own impressions. I left my role in NICSR at the end of 2022, and what I say today is not as an IES or a Department of Education official. And the other thing I want to say is that I felt really weird throughout thinking through some of these issues without continually thinking about Doug. And so I'll talk about Lynn here, but of course, Doug has always been an essential partner in this work. All right, and I kind of fed Joe this question about the context for Lynn's work for NICSR, because when NICSR started up, we were in a very tentative position, and Lynn's work was instrumental in helping us get started. So as a quick reminder for some of you who were there from the beginning and those of you who are rising up through the ranks, the Institute of Education Sciences was started through a congressional mandate in 2002. That's when the legislation was passed. And the National Center for Special Education Research was authorized, put into IES through the reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that wasn't until the end of 2004. And so we, and I'm going to say we, even though I'm not a part of it anymore, because it's in my very being to be a part of NICSR. So NICSR came to IES, the IES party, fairly late. And so it was a daunting task because we had to catch up. And we had to do things like develop the calls for applications that would bring in high quality research. We needed to establish ourselves as the place to do special education research. And we needed to provide the technical assistance to support the development of the kind of research that's needed to get through the IES peer review panels, but also research that could be implemented well in the schools and other education settings. So, as one might expect, it was a process that needed to take time. And I came to the Institute in the beginning of 2009. Everybody thought there was going to be a hiring freeze when Obama came into office, so they process my paperwork pretty quickly. And we were making progress on all of those fronts. However, shortly after that, and hopefully not associated with me coming to IES, our budget was substantially cut. What happened was Nixer was singled out as the center to get substantial cuts. And then at the same time, there was an across-the-board government-wide sequestration, which means every agency got their budget cuts. So the end result was about a 25% drop in our budget. And so it was very deflating for all of us, but we still had to continue to do the work and to prove ourselves as an entity that could do high-quality work that was important. So this is the backdrop of what Lynn did, and I'd like to talk about a couple of the areas in which I thought that she contributed. So on the application peer review panel front, you all know, and Renee and I have talked about the fact that we could just get up here and say, yeah, everything that they've said the last couple of days, because everybody has mentioned a lot of the work a lot of the kinds of things we want to talk about. So she submitted thoughtful and innovative applications that were highly rated and importantly were exemplars for other people to know that, yes, we can get through these applications through IES, and this is how to do it. And I think Paul talked about Lynn sharing her application, and those are the kinds of exemplars that we didn't have at the beginning that we really needed. So she was important for us for that reason. She also served as a peer reviewer often, and I didn't realize until I went through how often she was a peer reviewer. Especially at the beginning. She would do it on a fairly frequent basis. And she also served as a panel chair for some of these peer review meetings. And you all talked about what a thoughtful and considerate person she was in giving feedback. And I think her leadership in the peer review panels was important in giving folks the kind of feedback that we needed so that they could resubmit and not be totally deflated that they didn't make it the first time. She was called on numerous times to help Nixer develop new programs. We often had technical working groups and to bring in experts to say, okay, we want to do X. How should we go about doing that? What are the things that you recommend? And Lynn was always very helpful for us thinking about new competitions or targeted funding. And some of this was in the formal technical working group, but she was also very helpful to me as a commissioner, always asking, questions of how she could help and answering my questions. And also my predecessors, I know she was in touch with as well. She also provided strong leadership in the field. Her research designs were exemplary, and her implementation was thoughtful and creative and motivated. And the things that were talked about here are exactly why she should be doing the research all along. The training that went into having people go out and collect data and all of that was just exactly what the field needed. And the other thing that we had, on our backs in Nixer was we have to get things into the What Works Clearinghouse. These other folks in the other centers have been, able to put things in, and we were just starting, and we needed to get work in there and up there so that when people came to look for things for kids with disabilities and what works, there'd be something there. And of course, Lynn contributed to that, and her work was often used to justify our funding to Congress, which we had to put in every year. Her work led to publications in top journals with dissemination, including internationally. And some of the comments that came out of the memorial service that Doug shared with me, and some of the most moving ones were from people in other countries and how her work made a difference even abroad. And she never said no when we asked her to present her findings or to work with us in helping to disseminate work. And one of the things that I remember is I was a new commissioner, and we got the board for IES to focus on special education. And this was right after the budget cuts, and we really needed their support. And we were desperate to get our names and our work in there. And Lynn was one of the folks that presented on that day, and like really hit the mark. And afterwards, one of the veterans on the board said, "This is the center that they cut funds on?" Because the work was so compelling. Okay, I promise I will give Renee a chance to talk. She also worked to translate research to practice, and certainly Renee will talk about that. But I also wanted to talk about her work on the practice guides, in particular the one on math. I don't have access to data anymore at IES, but looking back, I know that even just a year or so after that, the practice guide for math was put out, it had been viewed like over 60,000 times and downloaded 10,000 times, and that was when it was fairly new, so I know that that has continued. I can't talk about her impact without talking about many of you, her students, who are represented and have done remarkable presentations on your own work. And you've all gone on to do exemplary work in strong academic institutions, conducting work that Lynn would have been very happy and proud of. And Nixer certainly was happy that this work has continued. The only other thing I'll say now is that she was generous with her support. And this goes on a very personal level. And I brought Kleenex, like it's taken an umbrella so it won't rain. I brought my Kleenex so I wouldn't cry. But she was also personally helpful in checking in on how I was doing. And all that, I shouldn't say all that. Sometimes there was a lot of craziness going on at IES, and she was always there to say, what can we do? And that was very much appreciated. The only other thing I'll say is I think when Debbie Spees left the commissioner role, I was put in as acting commissioner. And John Easton, the director of IES at the time, said, you'll be associate, and I asked him, do you want me to just keep the doors open or do you want me to act as commissioner? He said, oh no, I want you to act as commissioner. But he said, I have to check it out with some people in the field before I make it formal. And I have a feeling he had a direct line to Lynn and Doug, and so I'm actually appreciative that I was in that role, in part because of their comments. Okay, thank you.
Renee, multi-tiered systems of support, RTI, PBIS, have become the model for schools to provide academic and social support across the nation. Can you talk about the influence of Lynn's work on MTSS? How is it continuing? How is it impacting schools today?
First, I need to do my really fast 30 seconds of disclaimer. I'll start by saying that it's really hard to adequately talk about Lynn's impact. And secondly, I totally feel like a fish out of water. Paul, you said that earlier, and I was counting the number of things that were stolen before I said them, but you said that earlier, and I'm not a research scientist. I am a consumer of your research. I am an advocate of your research. I am a translator of your research. I am a try to make politicals understand what research is and why it's important. So it's a privilege to share with you. My remarks will be very different from those that others have shared. I am here on my personal time as a grateful friend, mentee, and colleague of Lynn's. And nothing I say should be attributed past my own personal opinion. That said, I too have to start with, I'm going to start with a very quick story. There's this tree in my neighborhood in the springtime. I drive in, and it's this absolutely beautiful display of the world waking up and giving us hope. And I have always looked at this tree because it is this mix of like a pear tree and a tulip tree. So when it has this huge canopy over it, it's just this gorgeous, gorgeous tree. And so one time I stopped when the owner was there, and I have shade. I can't have a tree that requires sun in my yard. I'm saying, I love this tree. It gives me such hope every spring. It's just so beautiful. What kind of tree is it? And he said, come here. I walked over with him, and he said, this is actually 2 trees that have been braided together since they were saplings or small, small trees, and it's about 30 years old. That's how I've always thought about Lynn and Doug. To me, I can't talk about Lynn without Doug, because they've always been this beautiful tree to me. So I share that story. Now I'm not going to cry. So MTSS, I put it in my pocket for the same reason. So MTSS, let me talk a little bit about this one. This question is going to be the easiest of all of mine, so it will be quick and a bit more technical. So today, around 46 states have policies about MTSS. About 86% of state improvement plans contain language that includes the systematic implementation of MTSS. MTSS has become a common implementation framework for most states, districts, and schools. I'm going to take you back a little bit, and I wish John Compton was still here because I have several comments to make on his presentation yesterday, but he was scared to stay and took off early. So in 2000, we started, 1999 or 2000, I can't remember the exact date, but we started the LD Research Center, which I remember a bit differently from Don. Part of that work, we commissioned 9 white papers. These weren't topics easily identified, authors easily identified, nor did the papers result in great consensus or any consensus for some of them after they were developed. In 2001, we had a CNN live broadcast Hill Summit on learning disabilities, the state of learning disabilities. Shortly after that summit, in I think 2002, Lynn, Doug, I think Sharon was initially involved in the conversations, Lou Danielson, a host of folks. We were like, what in the hell did we just do? And how are we going to make this work in schools? So part of that effort was to bring together about 12-ish fabulous thinkers, deep problem thinkers, for 2 days. And we met at AIR, and we had 2 topics. What is response to intervention going to look like in schools if we go forward with this idea and have to actually operationalize it and do something about it? And what's the role of progress monitoring? So really quickly, this happened on June 24th and 25th of 2002. And you might say, oh wow, you remember that so well. I do, because I delivered my daughter 3 weeks early the day after it was finished, that evening. So that date is very clear in my mind. So me feeling nervous about the meeting was actually labor, but we persisted. So, but that meeting was so important because it really set the trajectory in my mind and historical recollection of what RTI was going to be, and then eventually what MTSS was going to be. And it was another great example of Lynn and Doug being able to conceptualize things in a way that nobody had really thought about, is this possible? They were just, it is possible, and how are we going to make it work? So, and the LD Research Center was critical in operationalizing what it was going to look like. I don't remember that center as being as easy as Don did. I remember Lynn being a beautiful referee in that center, and really focusing us on what it was supposed to look like in practice. So this is where I'm going to talk about the policy real quickly. In 2004, we reauthorized the IDA. Both the statutes and the regulations included practices such as RTI for LD identification, the importance of early screening, looking at tiered interventions, expertly delivered evidence-based practices, CBM/progress monitoring, and looking at response to intervention. So you had a federal statute reauthorized and the subsequent regulations that all included things that y'all talked about yesterday and earlier today. In 2010, we focused on expanding what we were talking about with learning disabilities to kids with disabilities in general. And then eventually it was, well, this is working so well for LD kids and kids with disabilities, we're going to do it with all kids. So this kind of trajectory of how it went. I think that in 2015, and this is where I think the Lynn's fingerprints and the Fuchs effect, as I might call it, really kind of comes out, because the Elementary Secondary Education Act was reauthorized, and they included MTSS, PBIS, progress monitoring, evidence-based practices. And special ed practices had never made it to ESEA. So again, from a policy perspective, such an incredible contribution. And Lynn was always focused on how do we get the best we know to be the standard for all students. And I was so happy to hear some of the things I've been thinking about said from so many of y'all, because it wasn't just my perception. There was a lot of triangulation and, iterator reliability in this group. So she looked at how we train teachers with the advanced skills that we needed to be able to be an expert teacher or an interventionist or specialist, not just a generalist in classrooms. How do we address the needs across the different tiers? So it's not just Lynn's work, but I do think it's fair to say that her contributions with Doug and others, and mostly her behind-the-scenes dedication to figuring out the how of research to policy, the how of how do we get it from research to practice, was significant. One of my favorite memories is sliding into, restaurant booths, especially DC Chop House, and what in the hell are we going to do? We got to think about this, and you do this and you do this, and those were such fond memories. Last part I'll say is in this past 2025, December 2025, OESE, IES, and OSERS held a joint coordinated summit on MTSS at the department. And it was focused on where we've come from and what's this MTS integrated combined system going to look like going forward. And sometimes I lose a little bit of hope, especially when that tree is not blooming on my ride home, but it really gave me hope, like the last 2 days have here, about the young people and those that are picking up the baton to keep this work going. Brandy Simonson and Michael Coyne from an IES grant are really looking at that. And each of you, with the research you shared yesterday and today, is contributing small pieces to what's possible when we continue to look at MTSS and serving kids.
Great. Thank you very much, Renee. So this question is for both of y'all, and you can fight each other over who wants to answer it first. But we've talked a lot over the last 2 days about Lynn's role as a collaborator. And I think we've talked about it in terms of both the individual basis, but also among different colleagues at different universities. Can you guys speak to her role as a collaborator, not only at the individual basis, but maybe bringing different institutes and centers together to sort of solve some of these problems?
Go ahead, they need a break from me.
Okay. So Lynn's projects were often very large. She, for example, had a couple of our research and development center type projects were $10 million for 5 or 6 years. So there was money in there not only to do the research, but also to make sure that there are collaborative efforts. And these projects would include people with different expertise, like bringing folks in with a cognitive science background and bringing in not only principal investigators that could help get the grants, but also the junior faculty and the collaboration with the school districts and that kind of thing. So that was something that was kind of built into some of the work that Lynn did. And as part of these large investments, there were resources that could be used to even do further collaborations. For example, one of the projects that they had, they brought in researchers from different backgrounds and various expertise to discuss moderator analyses and intervention research, which led to a special issue of exceptional children. And I can't remember who talked about it, but I felt like after the meeting, I felt like a smarter person, because it really was like digging deep and thinking about, why are these things, these interventions working or not working? What else can we be doing, and how can we be putting them in our research projects so we learn more? She was also generous with collaboration, and when you go through her publication list, you see that many people benefited from the work, not just the principal investigators, and that was just a real gift. Do you want to ask the second part of that question, or should we answer this part about why?
Why?
Yeah, okay. Yes, okay, why was she such a great collaborator? I have a very short answer to this. She was smart, and she had so much to offer. People would be crazy not to want to collaborate with her, right? And her ego was in the right place, and that is a continued theme of the last 2 days. She was often the smartest person in the room, but she didn't need to prove it in that room. And that made her great. And I'd like to just share a story about this collaborative nature that one of my program officers told me, my former program officers, who I won't name any names, but she did come out with a degree from Vanderbilt. When Lynn submitted applications, they would often go to the math panel. And that panel it evaluated the applications from NICSR, but also National Center for Education Research. And for those of you, probably you all know the process and could tell it to me by heart, but just if you don't know that process. So once somebody submits an application, the Office of Science takes that application, sees what it's about, and then they search for people who would be appropriate primary reviewers. And they would pick 2 or 3 people who are experts in the field to review it. And then the day of the panel meeting, there would be others on the panel, maybe 15 or sometimes even 20 people, who would ask questions they would hear about the application from the primary reviewers and ask questions, and then they would all rate the review, rate the application. So what what ended up happening in these panels is that, sometimes there would be someone who might have been a co-author with an applicant, and were somehow doing a project that would have been a conflict of interest. So at the very beginning of that discussion, they have all the people that have a collaborative relationship with the applicant. They had to have them leave the room. They would go out and wait, and after the application was discussed and rated, those people could come back in. And the story goes that whenever Lynn's application would come in, most of the people in the room left because they were all collaborating with her. And it was funny, but it was true, and that they really had to struggle to find people who would review it, who would do a review without any conflict there. Okay, that's all I want to say.
I'm just going to do the why part. Why was she such a great collaborator? And I should have said this in the beginning. Joe Wehby and I go back 40 years in this room. Lynn and Doug and I go back almost 30 years in this room. So it's really hard for me to kind of boil down to some of these stories, I think, that are worth sharing and trying to honor Lynn's work. In my almost 30 years of federal service, I have had lots of opportunities to meet folks all across the country, and I have not met or witnessed many people that are able to so articulately and seamlessly combine what I'm going to use, and they're bad terms, but just bear with me for today, the hard skills of the gold standard researcher extraordinaire and the softer skills of a collaborator. Being generous with not only your knowledge, but the process of your knowledge. Being able to give of your time, authentically dedicated to making learning and life better for children. Curious, willing to look at possibilities beyond her comfort zone, and with people sometimes beyond her comfort zone. I think that is, it's easy to collaborate with friends, or it should be. It's not always easy, but it's easier to collaborate with friends. It's really hard to collaborate with folks that don't share some of your same vision. I cannot even try to come up with the number of times that Lynn was patient with me, with my request that might have been, how do we get Doug to focus in this meeting, to haranguing a group of charged up boys. These are researchers, not students. Both of these are funny. It's funny now. It was a little scary then for me, wet behind the ears, new project officer in DC. But she was always able to help with how to think about what we know worked with groups of kids with disabilities, and how we expand that to classrooms, to schools, and most importantly, to state and federal policy. I thought her thinking, and also Doug's thinking on why these seemingly simple practices weren't able to happen for every kid every day in every school, have been such amazing contributions on their part. Because I think it's one thing to have an evidence-based practice. I think it is a totally different conversation to have that practice implemented for every kid every day in schools. And they were effective at both of those. I also thought I'm just thinking about her continued patience with me, is looking at not only was she patient, and I heard people talk about her kind feedback, but I would say, well, why can't we just do this? And Lynn would say, because we don't know that for sure. This is what we know. This is what we can say. And that was always such important guidance for me. It taught me much more about appreciating true evidence-based practices and how we talk about those in a fair way when we're trying to put them in the bigger context of policy and practice. She was willing to share and have conversations. She put up with my behaviorist approach to life, and more importantly, she put up with some of my behaviorist colleagues that I would say, you know, you should really get together with so-and-so so we can talk about this in a different way. An example of her willingness to talk about different scenarios, I have been working a lot on school violence, schools recovering from school violence issues. And my last professional conversation with Lynn was very much about some of the work she's been doing. You know, how do we help schools that have been through a horribly tragic and traumatic event and help those kids accelerate their learning, help those teachers decide what are the most foundational skills we need to teach the quickest if we've got to not only shorten our, our instructional period, but also deal with the tremendous impact of trauma on learning. And she was always so very generous on that. Beyond the research that y'all have shared, I want to spend a few minutes on this. The Fuchs effect has also contributed powerfully to very important broad understandings in special education. Number one, high incidence disabilities, which is an IDA category for disabilities that exist in large numbers, does not mean that the services and supports that those children require are less intensive of an effort. For example, deaf and blind students, deaf or blind students often have a much easier time navigating special education success and school success than students with significant learning disabilities or significant behavior disorders. That should not be a controversial conversation, but it has for years. And Lynn helped with that conversation. The second one is looking at students in each of these eligibility categories, and learning disabilities was her category of focus, but it applies across the board. They vary in their intensity of needs. Every LD student is not like every other LD student. They have similar characteristics in their need for eligibility purposes, but it is unfair for us to look at every LD student in the same need and support, level of need and support. And again, it's a conversation you don't think would have controversy, but it did. And she made a difference in that conversation. And the last one I'll mention from a policy perspective is least restrictive environment. One of the key premises of IDA, free appropriate public education is a first in the least restrictive environment. It is not synonymous with the general education classroom. And this probably, I think, has been Lynn and Doug's most powerful contribution. We have never said that, although there's been a preference for serving students in the general education classroom, I think one of their most important questions that they gave to us to think about was, do we have the evidence base of how to deliver intensive interventions to this student? And we could say yes there, because there were all the data that y'all been talking about, these intensive interventions. That's not the only question we have to ask. We also have to ask, do we have the expertise to deliver that level of intervention in the general education classroom? I would say without a cloning process of Lynn and or some of you in this room, the answer to that question is usually no. So can we do it? Yes. Can we do it in the general education classroom? Not always. So if we can't, then the least restrictive environment for that student with those intensive needs may not be the general education classroom. That's a huge policy discussion. And Lynn eloquently was able to weave through the different parties there. These were and continue to be pivotal discussions. Lynn and I didn't always fully agree on everything. I went to her for counsel, but I always knew she was a trusted person. I knew I could pick up the phone, she would call me back, and then she wouldn't say, "You would not believe what Renee Bradley asked me." She would give me trusted counsel. She always listened selfishly, she shared, and often would revisit things later on because she had thought about them more. There's a quote from T.S. Eliot that says, "Only those that risk going too far can possibly find out how far we can go." And I think that's so on target for what she did, because it was never enough just to go there. And y'all said this over and over in the last 2 days. She always said, "Well, what's next?" Or "How do we move this forward?" Or "What do we do with this going forward?"
Thank you. So getting close to time here. So Joan, is there some specific research projects or any of her projects you want to particularly call out as being part of her legacy?
I would love to.
Okay. It's almost like you know these questions.
He didn't want us up here blubbering mess the whole afternoon.
So the issues that Lynn took on her research, as you can tell from Renee's conversation, is they're some of the most important in special education: tiered intervention, math, reading, comorbid disabilities. All of those things, yes, they are important, but also from the Nixer perspective, what was important was what she did to move the research field forward. And I'd like to just cover a few of those. She did measurement work. Researchers were very reluctant to take on measurement work. We used to try to get people to do measurement work all the time because there's not a lot of money in it, and it's really hard work. But I've never been in a conversation about measurements when people don't say, "Oh, we don't have the right measures," but it's just really hard work to do, and she took that on. She also often combined our research goals into one project. For example, she combined development work with efficacy. And I remember her saying once, "I don't see why anyone needs to have a development grant," which, some people have found that as a great space to, lay for a couple times. But Lynn said you can just combine it with efficacy, and she did in her projects. And she also did exploratory work with intervention development. So talk about efficient. That was the way she rolled. Her designs often included focusing on cognitive factors such as working memory and executive function. As I said before, digging deeper into issues that may explain the success or lack of success for interventions. And she studied the long-term follow-up of findings. That is something that we often haven't had the leisure to in our field as we're trying to sort of ramp up. But she did that. She looked at those long-term effects. And by God, for her interventions, she got them. And she conducted replication studies. Another thing that the field desperately needs is more replication. And she did it often within one grant. She did, as many of her students and those who helped her with the work in the schools know, she often did replication studies. And at one point, we were able to have a separate competition on replication, and she also did it that way as well. And she also supported Nixer's early career development program. As I understand it from my source who graduated from Vanderbilt, the final product of the class with graduate students was an early career grant application. And that, from my perspective, is just invaluable. How do you learn that process? How do you learn what goes in an application and what should just stay in your head? So she just was instrumental in there, and obviously folks came out successful. And her mentoring obviously was of high quality and helped shaped all the work that we've heard about and more from today.
Anything else for Renee on the legacy?
Yeah, I'm going to add just a few things, and I've tried to cut out some things, so hopefully this still works together. I think I chose Lynn as a mentor far sooner than she liked me. But I found myself in these grants, and this is a long time ago, with mostly men. I was a behaviorist. I was in LD and juvenile justice grants. It was an interesting time, and I quickly gravitated to observing Lynn. And I learned so much by her successful navigation of topics and people, how she could debate without making it an argument. It was just, she could just do it. And her quiet confidence was always amazing and something I unsuccessfully strived for. And I also think her ability to handle intense situations. So I share that just because I think that's part of the legacy. And there are more awards that she's gotten than we can ever have time to talk about, but I did want to mention a couple. Forbes described her as a revolutionary educator. And my friend John Lloyd, in a 2025 piece about women who lead special education, all the other women on the list were described as researchers, teachers, authors, or advocates. Lynn was described as a rocket scientist. And that's so perfect. The older I get, I realize this kind of look at legacy. So when we're talking about legacy, we're looking at what continues to exist, what's your imprint, what endures, what's on your dash, the time you come and the time you leave, what makes up that dash. So the legacy of Lynn's research is undoubtedly going to be continued and recognized as seminal and foundational. I believe her greatest legacy is the people that she has touched, not just Doug and Matt and Miles, but all of you that are in this room that had the great joy of working with her and under her and learning from her. So I just wanted to leave with 3 quick questions. One, I would just ask you, how will you honor the legacy that Lynn has entrusted to us as we go forward? I love Kristen talking about follow a good model. So how are we going to follow that good model? And how do you continue it forward so that it doesn't just live in schools and classrooms around the country, but help others climb the ladder? Lynn did that beautifully. Help others believe in themselves, sometimes more than we believe in our own selves, and navigate the storms and value not only your personal successes and research, but the value of our collective work together. And I heard something over and over again over the last 2 days, so I'll end with this. Please don't apologize for the personal stories of impact that people have on your life, because that's how Lynn continues to live. It's through those personal stories, okay? You're her legacy, and then lots of people that couldn't be here with us today. But legacy's super important, and hers, I'm sure she would say, I am more proud of the people that I impacted than the actual research that I've done.
Thank you very much, both of y'all.